I was lying in a hospital bed recovering from my sixth cesarean section when my husband threw divorce papers directly onto my lap. He stood over me and told me to pack my bags and take my daughters back to the hood because his family legacy required a son. His mother stood behind him laughing at my pain. His brother-in-law smirked and told me to be grateful they were letting me keep my old car. They all thought I was just a broke freelance bookkeeper who relied on their wealth to survive. They had no idea I was about to strip away every single thing they owned with just 4 words. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the private recovery room at the Atlanta Medical Center. My body ached with that deep, tearing pain that only comes from being sliced open to bring a new life into the world. My beautiful newborn daughter was sleeping quietly in the clear plastic bassinet beside my bed. She was perfect, but her father had not even bothered to look at her. The heavy wooden door of my room had been kicked open minutes earlier and Malik marched in. I was wearing his custom-tailored navy blue suit, the one he always wore to his board meetings at Vanguard Capital. He did not bring flowers. He did not ask how I was feeling after 12 hours of labor. He simply walked straight up to my bed and dropped a thick manila folder onto my chest. I stared at the folder, and then up at the man I had been married to for 10 years. Malik glared down at me with absolute disgust. He told me that he was done wasting his time with a woman who had weak genetics. He said he needed a male here to carry on his name and maintain his image in the community. 6 daughters were an embarrassment to a man of his stature, and he was filing for divorce immediately. He demanded that I sign the papers and vacate our estate by the end of the weekend. Before I could even process the sheer cruelty of his words, a second figure stepped into the room. It was Vivian, my mother-in-law. She was dressed in head-to-toe designer clothing, carrying a handbag that cost more than most people make in a year. She looked at me like I was something she had scraped off the bottom of her shoe. Vivian crossed her arms and told Malik that she had warned him about me from the very beginning. She said a woman from the South Side projects would never have the right bloodline to give them a proper heir. She boasted about their family representing the pinnacle of Black excellence and how my existence was a stain on their generational wealth. She told me to take my girls and go back to the government housing where I belonged because I was no longer welcome in their circle. I slowly shifted my weight against the hospital pillows, ignoring the burning pain in my abdomen. I did not shed a single tear. I just looked at the people who were supposed to be my family. Then another voice echoed from the hallway. Trent, my white brother-in-law, leaned against the doorframe with a smug grin on his face. Trent was married to Malik's sister Jasmine, and he worked as a financial director right under Malik at the investment firm. He always acted like a savior who had graced our family with his presence. Trent let out a condescending laugh and told me to just sign the documents. He said Malik was being incredibly generous by letting me keep the old Honda Civic and whatever pennies I made from my little freelance bookkeeping gig. He warned me not to make things difficult, because I could never afford to fight their corporate lawyers in court. They all stood there waiting for me to break down. They expected me to beg for forgiveness, to plead for financial support, to cry over the end of my marriage. They truly believed I was a helpless housewife who spent her days entering data into spreadsheets for small businesses just to buy groceries. They had built this entire narrative where Malik was the wealthy provider and I was the desperate charity case. I reached over to the bedside table and picked up my glass of ice water. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The cold water felt grounding. I set the glass back down and picked up the manila folder from my lap. I pulled out the divorce papers. Malik tapped his expensive watch and told me to hurry up because he had a celebratory dinner to attend. I looked down at the signature line. Then I gathered the thick stack of papers in my hands and tore them perfectly in half. I placed the torn pieces gently back onto the tray table. Malik took a threatening step forward, his face twisting with rage. He asked me if I had lost my mind and reminded me that he could easily leave me with absolutely nothing. Vivian gasped and called me ungrateful. Trent just shook his head and muttered that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. I looked directly into Malik's eyes, completely unbothered by his anger. I kept my voice perfectly calm and steady. I told him he had no idea what a mistake actually looked like. Then I said the 4 words that would change everything. I own your firm. The hospital room fell dead silent for a fraction of a second before Malik burst into loud, mocking laughter. He turned to his mother and brother-in-law, shaking his head. He told them the epidural medication must have made me hallucinate. Vivian rolled her eyes and said it was pathetic how desperate I was becoming. Trent chuckled and told me that Vanguard Capital managed hundreds of millions of dollars, and a freelance tax girl like me could not even afford the landscaping bill at their office building. They were completely convinced I had lost my grip on reality. I did not argue with them. I simply reached under my pillow and pulled out my cell phone. I opened a secure application that I had kept hidden for nearly a decade. I looked at the screen, confirming that the final legal transfers had been authorized by the Federal Exchange Commission. I pressed a single red button on the screen and locked the phone, setting it down beside me. Less than 10 seconds later, the silence in the hospital room was shattered. Malik's phone began to vibrate violently in his breast pocket. A custom emergency ringtone echoed through the room. At the exact same moment, Trent's phone started buzzing frantically from his trousers. The two men stopped laughing. Malik pulled his phone out, looking annoyed at the interruption. Trent checked his screen and his casual smirk instantly vanished. I watched as the blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His jaw went slack, and his hands began to tremble so badly that he nearly dropped the device onto the floor. The email they were reading was a high-priority alert sent directly from the board of directors. It contained the immediate restructuring notice that Vanguard Capital had just undergone a hostile and absolute takeover. Every single share, every voting right, and every executive decision now belonged to a parent company they had never heard of until this exact moment. Trent stumbled backward, hitting his shoulder against the doorframe as he read the same urgent notification. He scrolled frantically, trying to make sense of the legal jargon filling his screen. The document explicitly stated that the new chairman of the board, the sole owner of their entire professional existence, was officially taking command effective immediately. And the name printed in bold black letters, at the very bottom of that corporate mandate, was my own. Vivian noticed the sudden shift in the atmosphere. She demanded to know what was happening, why her son looked like he had just seen an apparition. She grabbed Malik's arm, shaking him and ordering him to speak. But Malik could not form a single coherent sentence. He just kept staring from the glowing screen of his phone to my calm face and back again. The financial empire they had used to humiliate me, the generational wealth they had bragged about, the status they held over my head, had just been pulled right out from under their feet. They were about to realize that the woman they were throwing away was the only reason they had a roof over their heads. Malik stared at the glowing screen of his phone as if the device had physically burned him. His eyes darted rapidly back and forth, reading the same paragraph over and over again. The message was sent directly from the executive board of Vanguard Capital. It detailed a hostile takeover that had been executed with ruthless precision. Apex Financial Tech had completely bought out their firm. Every single share of stock had been acquired. Every executive decision was now under the jurisdiction of the new parent company. And the chairman of Apex Financial Tech was listed clearly at the bottom of the message. It was Valerie. The silence in the hospital room grew heavy and suffocating. I sat up slightly, adjusting my newborn daughter against my chest, and watched the arrogant confidence completely melt off my husband's face. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw hung open, but no words came out. He just kept looking from the email to my face, trying to find some crack in my expression that would tell him this was all a cruel joke. There was no joke. I had spent months orchestrating this exact moment down to the very last detail. Trent broke the silence first. He was staring at his own phone, his thumb scrolling frantically through the corporate mandate. He shook his head violently, denying the reality right in front of him. He looked at me with wild eyes and stammered that this was completely impossible. He pointed a shaking finger in my direction and shouted that I was nothing but a freelance tax girl who worked out of the guest room. I insisted there was no way a woman who clipped grocery coupons could orchestrate a $100 million corporate buyout. He said I did not have the education or the connections to even walk into the lobby of their building, let alone purchase the entire operation. I let out a soft, cold laugh that echoed off the sterile walls of the hospital room. I looked down at my sleeping baby, rocking her gently before turning my gaze back to Trent. I asked him if he really thought I had spent the last 8 years just doing data entry for local businesses. I explained that the little tax software program I coded in our garage back when Malik and I first got married was not just a hobby. I had quietly patented the algorithm and sold it to a major tech conglomerate in Silicon Valley. The payout for that initial sale was $150 million. From there, I built an entire network of profitable tech investments that grew my wealth exponentially while I played the role of the quiet, supportive wife. Malik finally found his voice, though it was barely a hoarse whisper. He asked why I had never told him about the money. He asked how I could have lived with him for a decade, sleeping in the same bed, eating at the same table, and never once mentioned that I was a multimillionaire. I looked him dead in the eyes and told him the honest truth. I said I kept it a secret to protect his fragile male ego. I reminded him of how insecure he was when we first met, how he constantly needed to feel like the powerful provider to compensate for his own shortcomings. When he got his executive position at Vanguard Capital, he thought he was a financial genius. He thought he was closing massive deals and keeping the company afloat with his brilliant strategies. I told him the firm had been on the verge of bankruptcy for the last 5 years. I had been silently injecting millions of dollars in capital through anonymous shell companies just to keep his firm from going under. Every bonus he brought home, every luxury car he bought, every time he bragged about his financial dominance, it was all funded by my money. I had bought his success just so he could feel like a man in front of his wealthy friends. Vivian stepped forward, her face contorted with rage and disbelief. She refused to accept that the daughter-in-law she despised was actually the architect of their entire lifestyle. She pointed a trembling finger at me and screamed that I was lying. She yelled that it made no sense for me to have millions of dollars while pretending to be broke. She demanded to know why she had to pay out of her own pocket for my baby shower just last month if I was secretly a tech mogul. She said a real wealthy woman would never let her mother-in-law foot the bill for a cheap party and then sit there acting like she owned the world. I did not raise my voice. I simply told Vivian that I let her pay for the baby shower because I wanted to see exactly how much she actually cared about her granddaughter. I told her the party was a test and she had failed miserably. She had spent the entire time complaining about the cost of the balloons while insulting my family background to her church friends. I let her pay because I knew it would be the very last thing she would ever buy for my children, and I wanted her to show her true colors before I tore down her golden child. Vivian ignored me and turned to her son. She grabbed Malik by the arm and ordered him to call the bank immediately. She insisted that I was bluffing, and that the email was just a fake scam I had cooked up to scare them. She told him to check his accounts and prove that his wealth was still intact so they could kick me out of the hospital room and proceed with the divorce without any more of my ridiculous games. Malik swallowed hard, his hands still shaking. He navigated to his contact list and dialed the direct line for his private banking concierge. He put the call on speakerphone so everyone in the room could hear. The phone rang twice before a polite corporate voice answered the line, greeting Malik by name. Malik tried to sound authoritative, but his voice cracked as he demanded a complete status update on his liquid assets and investment portfolios. He ordered the banker to confirm his available balances immediately. The banker paused for a moment, and the sound of typing could be heard through the speaker. Then the banker delivered the news in a calm, professional tone that felt like a physical blow to the men standing in my room. The banker informed Malik that as of 10 minutes ago, every single financial account tied to his name had been completely frozen. The joint checking accounts, the emergency savings, the offshore investment portfolios, and all of the platinum credit cards were currently locked and deactivated. Malik panicked and demanded to know who authorized the freeze. He yelled into the phone that he was the primary earner, and no one had the right to touch his money without his direct signature. He threatened to sue the bank and have the concierge fired for gross incompetence. He paced the floor screaming that his family legacy was tied to those accounts and they were making a catastrophic mistake. The banker remained perfectly calm and corrected him. The voice on the speakerphone clarified that Malik was not the primary account holder. The accounts had always been legally structured under a master trust, and the sole executor of that trust had just enacted a total asset lockdown. The banker stated clearly that Valerie had initiated the freeze, and because she was the primary wealth holder, Malik had absolutely no legal authority to access a single penny. The banker apologized for the inconvenience and advised Malik to contact his wife's legal representation before disconnecting the call. The dial tone echoed loudly in the quiet hospital room. Malik stared at his phone, his mind struggling to process the absolute devastation of his reality. The man who had walked into my room just 10 minutes ago, feeling like an untouchable king, was now completely penniless. He had no company. He had no hidden savings. He had no access to the credit cards he used to fund his lavish lifestyle. I was entirely broke, and the divorce papers he had proudly thrown onto my lap were now the very things that would seal his absolute financial ruin. The reality of his empty bank accounts hung heavy in the sterile hospital air, but Malik was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. He stared at his useless cell phone for a long moment, before his panic slowly mutated into a vicious, twisting anger. He tossed the dead phone onto the floor where it clattered against the tiles, and he began pacing at the foot of my hospital bed. The sound of his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor echoed loudly in the quiet room, competing with the steady rhythm of my newborn daughter, breathing softly against my chest. He ran his hands over his face and let out a sharp, cruel laugh that sounded more like a bark of desperation. He stopped pacing and pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. He told me I was incredibly stupid for revealing my massive wealth while we were still legally married. He bragged that any family court judge in the state would look at our decade-long marriage and automatically mandate an equal split of all marital assets without hesitation. He puffed out his chest and declared that by secretly buying his firm, I had effectively handed him half of my entire technology empire on a silver platter. He paced back and forth, building his own false confidence with every aggressive step. He said he would hire the most ruthless corporate litigators in the city to drain my accounts dry and tie me up in litigation for the next 20 years. He swore he would take my millions and leave me with nothing but a broken family and a pile of daughters he never even wanted to raise. He smiled a nasty, triumphant smile, believing he had found the perfect legal loophole to secure his ultimate financial dominance over me. Malik leaned over the footboard of my bed with a wicked gleam in his dark eyes. He said I had failed my primary biological duty as a wife by giving him 6 useless girls, but he had already secured his precious legacy elsewhere without my help. He proudly announced that a real woman had given birth to his biological son exactly 3 months ago. Right on cue, the heavy wooden door of the recovery room swung wide open and hit the wall with a loud thud. Jasmine walked in, strutting with an air of absolute superiority and malice. She held the door back to make way for a much younger woman named Sierra, who walked into the room carrying a newborn baby boy wrapped in an expensive powder blue cashmere blanket. Jasmine stood beside her brother and looked at me with pure, unadulterated venom. She gloated that the entire family had known about Sierra for months, and they had all helped keep the dirty secret behind my back. Jasmine praised Sierra for being a woman of high class who actually knew how to carry a strong male child to term, unlike me. She happily confessed that Vivian had secretly purchased a luxury townhouse in the upscale suburbs just to ensure the mother of their precious heir lived in absolute comfort, while I was suffering through a high-risk pregnancy. They all stood together in a tight, unified circle, admiring the baby boy and smiling down at me, as if I were a piece of trash ready to be discarded. They truly believed they had engineered the perfect checkmate against my life. They thought my hidden tech millions would now automatically serve to fund the lavish lifestyle of Malik and his new replacement family. They imagined a bright future where my endless hard work paid for their luxurious international vacations and private school tuitions for the son I could never provide. I watched their pathetic display of family unity without letting a single emotion break through my calm, carefully constructed facade. I looked at the young mistress holding a child that was supposed to replace my own beautiful daughters. I looked at my sister-in-law, who had sat at my dining table eating food I paid for, while secretly helping my husband build a deceptive second life in the suburbs. I gently shifted my weight, holding my daughter securely with one arm, while I reached into the leather overnight bag, resting on the bedside chair. I pulled out a small silver flash drive and a thick legal document bound in a dark blue portfolio. I tossed the heavy portfolio directly onto the torn divorce papers scattered across my white hospital blanket. I smiled brightly at Malik and asked him if he honestly thought a woman smart enough to orchestrate $100 million corporate takeover would be stupid enough to leave her personal assets unprotected from a family of leeches. I asked Malik and Vivian if they remembered the turbulent early days of our marriage before he had secured his executive position. I reminded Vivian of how terrified she was that a broke girl from the South Side projects would somehow steal the imaginary generational wealth she constantly bragged about to her elite church friends. I calmly explained that 10 years ago, Vivian had forced her son to make me sign an incredibly draconian post-nuptial agreement to protect his future earnings from my supposedly greedy hands. I watched Vivian swallow hard as the memory of her own malicious and controlling actions flooded back into her mind. Malik stared at the blue portfolio, and the arrogant confidence began to drain from his face once again, leaving him looking hollow and terrified. I tapped the cover of the document and reminded him that his mother was so greedy and so incredibly suspicious of my background that she had their family lawyers draft the most aggressive penalty clauses legally possible in our state. I recited the exact phrasing of the infidelity clause from memory, making sure every single syllable landed with absolute precision and devastating weight. I stated that any party proven guilty of marital infidelity automatically forfeits all claims to marital assets, spousal support, corporate holdings, and shared property entirely without exception. I watched Malik process the terrifying reality of his own mother trapping him in an ironclad legal cage that he could never escape. Because the contract was drafted by his own elite legal team and signed willingly by both parties a decade ago, it was completely bulletproof in any court of law. I pointed to the young woman standing right next to him holding his 3-month-old son. I told Malik that his living, breathing, undeniable proof of infidelity was standing right inside my hospital room for the whole world to see. I explained that the divorce papers he had so arrogantly filed this morning were the exact legal trigger needed to activate the absolute penalty clause hidden deep within that contract. The 50-50 split he was banking on to fund his new life was completely void and legally impossible to enforce. I told him he would be walking out of this hospital with absolutely zero access to my tech empire, zero access to his former investment firm, and $0 in his bank accounts. I made it perfectly clear that his mother had essentially signed away his entire future the very moment she tried to protect him from me. The smug, triumphant smiles vanished from the faces of Jasmine and Sierra, instantly replaced by sheer panic. Sierra clutched her baby tight against her chest and looked frantically at Malik, demanding to know if what I was saying was actually true. She asked him repeatedly if he was really broke, and Malik could not even bring himself to look her in the eye to answer. The heavy silence stretched on, confirming her absolute worst fears about her supposedly wealthy provider. Jasmine took a sudden step backward, bumping hard into her husband Trent, who had been quietly watching his own corporate downfall unfold from the doorway. Trent suddenly realized that the immense wealth he thought his boss was about to steal from me was no longer a viable option to save their comfortable lifestyle. The terrifying reality of his own impending unemployment and total financial ruin snapped something deep and primal inside him. Trent pushed his way past his panicked wife and marched toward my hospital bed with his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He tried to physically intimidate me by towering over the mattress and puffing out his chest like a cornered animal. His face turned a deep, blotchy shade of red as he tried to assert his unearned authority over a woman he had always viewed as socially and financially inferior. Trent raised his voice and yelled that I could not just steal money from the man who single-handedly built Vanguard Capital from the ground up. He aggressively stated that Malik was his boss, and the executive board would never allow a random freelance woman to fire the director without a formal vote and a massive legal battle. He leaned in uncomfortably close, trying to scare me into backing down and giving up my rightful ownership of the firm. I did not flinch, pull away, or break eye contact with him for a single second. I looked at the angry white man standing over my bed and offered him a cold, lethal glare that made him freeze in his tracks. I told Trent to take a step back because I had not even started with him yet. Trent stood frozen, hovering over my hospital bed, his face a mask of red, blotchy rage. He was breathing heavily, preparing to shout another barrage of empty threats to protect his fragile authority. Before he could even exhale another aggressive breath, the heavy hospital door was pushed open with a sharp, violent thud. 4 massive private security guards stepped into the room, moving with absolute military precision. They were dressed in immaculate dark suits with communication earpieces discreetly tucked away, and their sheer size instantly dwarfed every other man in the room. They did not ask for permission to intervene. 2 of them immediately flanked my hospital bed, forming an impenetrable human wall between me and my furious in-laws. The other 2 guards stepped directly toward Trent. They grabbed him by his shoulders and forcefully spun him around, pressing him hard against the sterile white wall. Trent let out a startled, breathless gasp as his cheek was smashed against the cold plaster, his hands pinned securely behind his back. The arrogant financial director who had just been screaming in my face was instantly reduced to a helpless captive in a matter of seconds. I did not even blink as I watched him struggle. I gently shifted my newborn daughter in my arms, making sure she was perfectly comfortable before I reached back into my leather overnight bag. I pulled out a crisp manila envelope and tossed it onto the tray table right next to the torn pieces of my divorce papers. I looked directly at Malik, who was watching his brother-in-law get completely manhandled by my security team. I told Malik that I did not just buy his firm out from under him. I explained that my acquisitions went much deeper than corporate takeovers. I informed him that I had also purchased the debt on the $3 million mansion he currently lived in. I told him his mortgage had been severely underwater for months, and he had been desperately dodging collection calls. I explained that I had acquired the deed through one of my real estate holding companies, paying off the bank to secure total ownership of the property. I looked at the terrified expression on his face and told him he had exactly 24 hours to vacate my property before my security team physically threw his custom designer suits and his expensive watch collection onto the front lawn. Jasmine let out a piercing, dramatic scream, holding her hands up to her face in sheer horror. She lunged forward but stopped dead in her tracks when one of my bodyguards shifted his stance, blocking her path entirely. She yelled that I was an absolute monster for trying to put her brother on the street, especially now that he had a newborn son to take care of. She cried about family loyalty and basic human decency, begging me to reconsider for the sake of the baby. I simply looked at my sister-in-law and snapped right back at her. I asked Jasmine if she thought it was monstrous when her brother marched into my recovery room and tried to put me and his 6 daughters on the street barely 10 minutes ago. I told her to save her fake tears and her sudden moral outrage because her brother brought this entirely on himself. Then I looked her up and down, taking in her expensive outfit, and told her she had her own impending eviction to worry about anyway. Jasmine looked completely bewildered, demanding to know what I was talking about. She insisted that she and Trent owned their home outright and were completely financially secure. I turned my attention back to Trent, who was still pinned against the wall, breathing heavily and sweating completely through his expensive dress shirt. I told Jasmine that before I executed the hostile takeover of Vanguard Capital, I had my forensic accounting team conduct a massive stealth audit of their corporate books. I explained that her precious husband, the man who always acted like a high-earning white savior gracing our black family, with his superior financial intellect was actually nothing but a common thief. I watched the blood drain entirely from Jasmine's face as I revealed that Trent had been systematically cooking the corporate books for the past 3 years. I detailed how he had created a network of dummy vendor invoices and fake consulting fees to funnel stolen money directly into their personal accounts. He had embezzled over $2 million from corporate funds just to pay for Jasmine's exclusive country club memberships, her luxury international vacations, and her massive closet full of fake designer bags. Jasmine shook her head violently, refusing to believe a single word I was saying. She looked at Trent, begging him to tell me I was lying, begging him to clear his name and put me in my place. But Trent could not even look her in the eye. He just stared at the floor, his chest heaving with panic, his silence acting as a loud, undeniable confession to everything I had just exposed. I told them both that because I was now the sole legal owner of the firm, the millions of dollars he stole technically belonged to me. I announced that my legal team was already in the process of handing the entire unredacted audit report over to the federal authorities. I looked Trent in the eyes and promised him that I would absolutely be pressing full federal charges against him for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. The crushing reality of the situation hit the room like a violent earthquake. Vivian let out a guttural sound of pure outrage. The perfect illusion of her highly successful, affluent family was being dismantled piece by piece, and she could not handle the intense humiliation of it all. She realized that her daughter was about to be completely broke, her lifestyle exposed as a fraudulent lie, and her son-in-law was going straight to federal prison. Blinded by absolute rage, Vivian lunged toward my hospital bed, raising her hand high in the air, preparing to slap me across the face. She wanted to physically punish me for destroying the pristine elite image she had curated for her wealthy church friends. But before her hand could even come close to my skin, one of my bodyguards stepped in gracefully, catching her wrist mid-air. He held her arm firmly in place, neutralizing her frantic attack with zero effort. Vivian struggled against the massive guard's grip, spitting pure venom and calling me a vindictive homewrecker. She screamed that she would destroy my reputation in this city and make sure I never showed my face in their community again. I did not flinch or lean away from her anger. I just looked at my mother-in-law with a cold, empty stare, letting her exhaust herself against the immovable wall of my security team. I told her to keep her hands to herself, unless she wanted the senior pastor of her beloved megachurch to find out exactly where the massive congregation building fund really went. Trent stood completely paralyzed for a fraction of a second, hovering over my hospital bed with his fists tightly clenched. His face was a mask of red, blotchy rage, and his chest heaved with heavy, aggressive breaths as he prepared to shout another barrage of empty threats to protect his fragile corporate authority. Before he could even exhale, the heavy wooden door of the recovery room was pushed open with a sharp, violent thud that rattled the medical equipment. 4 massive private security guards stepped into the room, moving with absolute military precision and an intimidating, silent focus. They were dressed in immaculate dark suits with communication earpieces discreetly tucked into their ears, and their sheer size instantly dwarfed every other person standing in the space. They did not ask for permission to intervene, and they certainly did not care about the delicate family dynamic unraveling in front of them. 2 of the guards immediately flanked my hospital bed, forming an impenetrable human wall of muscle and Kevlar between me and my furious in-laws. The other 2 guards stepped directly toward Trent without a moment of hesitation. They grabbed the arrogant financial director by his broad shoulders and forcefully spun him around, pressing his body hard against the sterile white wall. Trent let out a startled, breathless gasp as his cheek was smashed against the cold plaster and his arms were swiftly pinned securely behind his back. The man who had just been screaming in my face, demanding that I surrender my wealth to his boss, was instantly reduced to a helpless captive, struggling uselessly against security professionals who barely even registered his resistance. I did not flinch or look away as I watched him squirm against the wall. I gently shifted my newborn daughter in my arms, making sure her tiny head was perfectly supported before I reached my free hand back into my leather overnight bag. I pulled out a crisp manila envelope and tossed it onto the plastic tray table right next to the torn, discarded pieces of my divorce papers. I looked directly at Malik, who was watching his brother-in-law get completely manhandled by my security team. His eyes were wide with sheer terror as he realized that the physical power in the room had shifted just as drastically as the financial power. I told Malik that I did not just buy his prestigious investment firm out from under him while he was busy parading around town with his mistress. I explained that my corporate acquisitions went much deeper than simply taking over Vanguard Capital and removing his executive title. I informed him that I had also purchased the highly leveraged debt on the $3 million luxury mansion he currently lived in. I watched his eyes dart to the manila envelope as I calmly detailed how his mortgage had been severely underwater for the past 8 months because he had been desperately bleeding his own accounts dry to fund a secret second family. He had been dodging collection calls and hiding past due notices, but banking institutions are always willing to sell off toxic debt to a private buyer with enough liquid capital. I explained that I had acquired the deed to his home through one of my anonymous real estate holding companies, paying off the bank in full to secure total unencumbered ownership of the property. I looked at the terrified, hollow expression on his face and told him he had exactly 24 hours to permanently vacate my property. I made it absolutely clear that if he was not completely gone by tomorrow afternoon, my security team would march into that house and physically throw his custom-tailored designer suits, his expensive watch collection, and every single piece of furniture he claimed to own directly onto the front lawn for the entire neighborhood to see. Jasmine let out a piercing, dramatic scream, holding her perfectly manicured hands up to her face in sheer horror. She lunged forward toward my bed but stopped dead in her tracks when the largest bodyguard shifted his stance, blocking her path entirely and daring her to take another step. She yelled that I was an absolute monster for trying to put her brother on the street, especially now that he had a fragile newborn son to take care of. She cried about family loyalty and basic human decency, begging me to reconsider my harsh actions for the sake of an innocent baby boy who needed a warm home. She put on a theatrical display of profound moral outrage, acting as if my legal eviction notice was the most unnatural and wicked thing a person could ever do to their own flesh and blood. I simply looked at my sister-in-law and snapped right back at her, cutting through her pathetic performance. I asked Jasmine if she thought it was monstrous when her beloved brother marched into my recovery room and tried to put me and his 6 daughters on the street barely 10 minutes ago. I reminded her that she had just walked into this hospital room grinning from ear to ear, ready to watch me get thrown into poverty, while she praised the mistress for giving the family a male heir. I told her to save her fake tears and her sudden hypocritical concern for family values because her brother brought this total destruction entirely upon himself by choosing arrogance over loyalty. Then I looked her up and down, taking in her expensive silk outfit and the flashy diamond jewelry she wore so proudly. I told her she needed to stop worrying about where Malik was going to sleep tomorrow night, because she had her own impending eviction to worry about very soon. Jasmine looked completely bewildered by my statement, demanding to know exactly what I was talking about. She insisted that she and Trent owned their gorgeous suburban home outright, and were completely financially secure thanks to her husband holding such a lucrative director position. She looked at Trent, who was still pinned firmly against the wall, breathing heavily and sweating completely through his expensive designer dress shirt. She told me I was delusional and just trying to scare everyone in the room with empty threats because I was bitter about the divorce. I turned my attention fully back to Trent, watching a bead of sweat roll down the side of his flushed face as he struggled to catch his breath. I told Jasmine that before I executed the hostile takeover of Vanguard Capital and froze all the executive accounts I had, my forensic accounting team conduct a massive stealth audit of their corporate books. I explained that when you purchase a financial institution for 9 figures, you have to verify every single ledger, every expense report, and every offshore routing number hidden in the company servers. I looked directly into Trent's panicked eyes and let a cold, confident smile spread across my face. I told Jasmine that I had uncovered a massive discrepancy buried deep within the vendor payment files that her husband was personally responsible for managing and protecting. I told the room that I was about to drop a financial bomb that would not just end their lavish lifestyle but would guarantee that the high-earning man she married would be spending the next decade locked away in a federal prison cell. Vivian froze completely with her wrist still locked in the firm grip of my security guard. The mention of the senior pastor and the congregation building fund seemed to suck the remaining oxygen right out of her lungs. She slowly pulled her hand back, cradling her wrist against her chest as she stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. For a woman like Vivian, her entire existence was built around her elite social standing in the community. She was not just a regular churchgoer. She was the untouchable treasurer of one of the largest and most influential megachurches in Atlanta. Her identity was wrapped up in the front row pew she occupied every Sunday, wearing her expensive hats and acting like the absolute pinnacle of moral authority. She loved to look down on young mothers and judge anyone who did not meet her strict superficial standards of Black excellence. Now that very foundation was cracking under the weight of my words. I told the entire room that my corporate takeover of Vanguard Capital had required a deep dive into all of the secondary accounts managed by their executives. I explained that when my forensic accountants were tracking the $2 million Trent had stolen, they stumbled upon a completely separate web of fraudulent transactions. I looked directly at Vivian and told her that we had found a massive offshore routing scheme connected to her personal signature. I detailed how she had not used a single dime of her own supposedly generational wealth to purchase that luxury townhouse for Malik and his mistress. Instead, she had secretly funneled $800,000 directly out of the church charity and building funds. She had exploited the trust of thousands of hardworking families who donated their hard-earned money to help the community, and she used it to buy a secret suburban hideaway for a woman who was actively destroying her own son's marriage. I wanted everyone in the room to understand the sheer depth of her hypocrisy, so I broke down exactly how she executed the theft. I explained that she had set up fake contracting companies and submitted fraudulent invoices to the church finance committee, claiming the money was being used for structural renovations on the community center. Once the church approved the payments, the funds were transferred into a blind trust managed by Trent at Vanguard Capital. Trent then washed the stolen money through a series of corporate accounts before issuing a clean cashier check to a real estate holding company. That holding company was conveniently registered under Vivian's maiden name. She had used the holy offerings of widows and working-class families to secure a pristine piece of real estate for her precious male heir and his mother. I told her that my accounting team had recovered every single forged invoice, every signed approval form, and every digital footprint, linking her directly to the grand theft. I reminded Vivian of all the Sunday mornings she had forced me to sit in the overflow seating area at the back of the sanctuary, while she proudly paraded Sierra near the altar. She had used her position of power to humiliate me in the house of religion, while secretly robbing the very people she was supposed to serve. Vivian began to hyperventilate, taking short, ragged breaths as the undeniable truth echoed through the quiet hospital room. Her perfectly styled hair seemed to lose its bounce, and the heavy gold jewelry around her neck suddenly looked like a chain dragging her down to the floor. She pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled that I had absolutely no proof of these ridiculous accusations. She insisted that she was a pillar of the community and that the entire congregation loved and respected her. She desperately tried to spin the narrative, claiming that I was just a bitter and jealous woman making up elaborate lies to destroy a good Christian family because my husband no longer wanted me. She looked around the room, searching for anyone to support her crumbling illusion of innocence. She begged Malik to tell me to stop talking, pleading with him to defend his mother against such vicious slander. But Malik was completely unresponsive. I was still staring blankly at the floor, unable to process his own total financial ruin, let alone protect his mother from hers. He knew that if my forensic team had caught Trent, they had definitely caught Vivian. Jasmine and Sierra were looking at Vivian with a mix of shock and dawning horror. Sierra clutched her baby tighter, realizing that the luxurious townhouse she had been promised was not a gift from a wealthy family, but a crime scene waiting to be seized by the government. She demanded to know if Vivian had really bought her home with stolen church money. Sierra yelled that she would not be held responsible for living in a house funded by stolen charity donations. Vivian ignored Sierra and continued to shout at me, insisting that her financial records were perfectly secure and that no one would ever believe a vindictive ex-wife over a dedicated church elder. She tried to convince herself aloud that she was legally protected and that the universe would punish me for bringing such wicked falsehoods against a prominent servant of the community. I did not raise my voice or interrupt her frantic rambling. I simply let her exhaust her remaining dignity while my security guards stood by with blank professional expressions. I told Vivian that her religious manipulation might have worked on the vulnerable members of her congregation, but it held absolutely no power over me. I reminded her that forensic accounting does not care about how many scripture verses she could quote or how much she prayed on Sunday mornings. Numbers leave an undeniable trail, and her trail led straight to a federal crime. I explained that stealing nearly $1 million from a registered nonprofit organization was not just a simple family dispute. It was a massive felony that carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. I told her that she would be trading her custom-tailored designer suits for a standard-issue prison uniform before the week was over. Vivian shook her head violently, refusing to accept the reality of her impending downfall. She claimed that she had powerful friends on the church board who would cover for any financial discrepancies and sweep the entire matter under the rug. She bragged that she had protected pastors and deacons from scandals in the past, and they owed her their absolute loyalty. She thought she was untouchable because she had spent decades building a network of corrupt favors and unholy alliances. She crossed her arms and told me that no federal agent would ever step foot inside her church to investigate a woman of her supreme social standing. I smiled gently at her arrogant delusion. I told her that she severely underestimated the speed and efficiency of a corporate legal team handling a massive financial acquisition. I explained that the moment I uncovered the embezzlement, I did not just sit on the evidence to use as a simple hospital room threat. I had my corporate attorneys bypass the corrupt church board entirely and hand the unredacted audit report directly to the federal authorities and the highest-ranking spiritual leaders in the state. I told Vivian that her untouchable status had officially expired the second my signature hit the takeover documents. Vivian opened her mouth to scream another desperate denial, but the words died in her throat. The heavy wooden door of my hospital room swung open once again, breaking the tension with a loud, deliberate creak. Standing in the doorway was Pastor Jenkins, the beloved and highly respected head of their massive congregation. His usually warm and comforting face was set in a rigid expression of absolute disgust and profound disappointment. But he had not come to the hospital alone. Flanking the pastor were two tall, plainclothes detectives wearing dark windbreakers with gold badges clipped to their belts. They were financial crime investigators from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and their eyes locked immediately onto Vivian. The room went completely still as the full weight of the situation finally crashed down on the woman who had spent a decade making my life miserable. Pastor Jenkins stepped fully into the room, bringing the chilling reality of federal law enforcement right to the foot of my hospital bed. He did not offer Vivian his usual warm pastoral greeting or extend a hand of spiritual comfort to the trembling woman. Instead, he looked at the church elder who had sat in his front row pews for a decade and shook his head with a profound sense of sorrow mixed with undeniable disgust. He told Vivian that the entire congregation had trusted her with the very heart of their community. He explained that the money she had siphoned away was not just numbers on a corporate spreadsheet, but the hard-earned tithes of elderly widows and working-class families who sacrificed their own comfort to build a better future for their neighborhood. Pastor Jenkins spoke of the youth community center that had been delayed for 3 years because Vivian kept claiming construction costs were rising due to inflation. He looked directly at the young mistress standing in the corner clutching the baby and told Vivian that it was absolutely repulsive that she had stolen from orphans and struggling families simply to purchase a luxury suburban house to hide her son's illegitimate affairs. The crushing disappointment in the pastor's voice was a fatal blow to Vivian and her carefully constructed social empire. She immediately dropped her wrist from her chest and took a desperate stumbling step toward him. She tried to deploy the same charming, charismatic religious persona she used every Sunday to manipulate the church finance board. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest and forced tears to well up in her eyes, putting on an elaborate theatrical performance of a persecuted saint. She cried out to Pastor Jenkins, begging him not to believe the vicious slander being thrown at her by a bitter and jealous woman. She pointed a frantic, trembling finger at my hospital bed and screamed that I was the real criminal in the room, weaving a web of deceit to ruin their blessed family. Vivian began to spin a wild and completely unhinged lie to save her own skin from the impending federal charges. She claimed that I had used my vast technology wealth to hire ruthless corporate hackers to infiltrate the church mainframes and manipulate the financial records. She yelled that I was a deeply unstable and vindictive ex-wife who wanted to destroy the holy work of the congregation simply because my husband had found a better woman to give him a son. She insisted that I had fabricated the offshore routing numbers and planted the digital evidence on her personal computer just to frame an innocent woman of faith. She sobbed dramatically, wiping fake tears from her cheeks, and told the pastor that she had spent her entire life serving the Lord and would never dream of touching a single penny of the sacred building fund for her own personal gain. Pastor Jenkins did not even blink at her frantic gaslighting attempts. He just stood there like a stone wall, refusing to let her manipulative tears sway his righteous judgment. He told Vivian to stop mocking his intelligence and insulting the very faith she claimed to uphold. He explained that before coming to the hospital, the federal agents had already presented him with the undeniable preliminary evidence tying the stolen funds directly to her personal real estate acquisitions. The two plainclothes detectives stepped forward, cutting off any further religious grandstanding from the disgraced mother-in-law. The lead detective, a tall, imposing man with a calm but lethal demeanor, introduced himself and his partner as special agents with the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Division. He stated clearly that they were not there to debate church politics or listen to family drama. They were there because wire fraud, money laundering, and the gross embezzlement of nonprofit organizational funds were massive federal offenses that carried decades of mandatory prison time. I watched the agents close the distance between the doorway and my bed, completely ignoring the frantic protests of my in-laws. I decided it was time to end Vivian and her pathetic attempts to deflect the blame onto me. I calmly reached back into my leather overnight bag and pulled out a thick, heavy dossier bound in dark plastic. I rested the heavy stack of documents on my lap, making sure everyone in the room could see exactly what I was holding. I spoke with a quiet, authoritative tone that cut right through Vivian and her chaotic sobbing. I told the federal detectives that they did not need to waste taxpayers' money spending months trying to build a circumstantial case against the corrupt church treasurer. I explained that when my corporate team executed the hostile takeover of Vanguard Capital, we did not just freeze the accounts, we downloaded every single encrypted server file the executives thought they had permanently deleted to hide their tracks. I extended my hand, offering the thick dossier directly to the lead federal agent. I told him that inside those pages he would find the exact IP addresses linking the fraudulent church vendor invoices directly to the private home network installed in Vivian and her massive estate. I detailed how the dossier contained the complete offshore routing history, showing the exact dates and times the stolen church funds were transferred into the holding company registered under her maiden name. I also pointed out that we had recovered the original digital approval forms featuring Vivian and her own forged signatures, authorizing the fake construction payments to non-existent companies. I made sure to emphasize that every single piece of digital evidence had been thoroughly scrubbed, verified, and authenticated by my elite corporate cybersecurity team before being printed out for their convenience and immediate use in a court of law. The lead federal agent accepted the heavy dossier from my hands, flipping through the first few pages with a practiced professional eye. He nodded approvingly at the sheer volume of irrefutable evidence I had just handed him on a silver platter. He closed the binder, tucking it securely under his arm, and turned his full attention back to the trembling woman who had tried to destroy my life just an hour ago. Vivian watched the exchange, and I could physically see the moment her entire reality snapped into a million unrecoverable pieces. She realized that her prestigious socialite status, her prominent church leadership role, and her very freedom were completely gone forever. There was no board of directors to bribe, and no charming smiles that could get her out of a federal indictment equipped with absolute mathematical proof. In a final act of pure desperation, Vivian turned her frantic, tear-stained face toward her golden child. She looked at Malik with wild, pleading eyes, begging her successful executive son to fix the catastrophic mess she had gotten herself into. She ordered him to use his vast wealth to call the best defense attorneys in Atlanta and stop the agents from taking her away in handcuffs. She yelled at him to leverage his corporate power to silence the investigation and protect their flawless family legacy from public ruin. She completely forgot in her blind panic that just moments ago I had revealed that Malik was entirely broke, his firm had been seized, and his corporate power was absolutely non-existent. Malik stood paralyzed near the foot of my bed, his custom-tailored suit suddenly looking far too big for his shrinking, cowardly frame. He looked at the two federal agents standing just inches away from his mother, and he began to calculate his own imminent danger. He knew that Trent was already caught for corporate embezzlement, and now his mother was caught for nonprofit wire fraud. He realized with terrifying clarity that his entire financial shield had evaporated, and the federal government would inevitably start looking into his own personal executive accounts to see what other illicit activities he had been hiding over the past 10 years. He knew that if he tried to defend his mother, he would undoubtedly be dragged right down into the federal prison system, alongside her losing whatever tiny shred of freedom he still possessed. The lead FBI detective took a step toward Vivian, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from the back of his belt. The metallic clinking sound echoed sharply against the sterile hospital walls, signaling the absolute end of her elite reign. He looked directly into her terrified eyes and told her in a flat, uncompromising voice that she was coming with them right now. I instructed her to turn around and place her hands behind her back because she was officially under arrest for multiple counts of grand larceny and federal wire fraud involving a protected religious institution. Seeing his own mother about to be shackled like a common criminal and terrified that the agents might suddenly turn their attention and their handcuffs toward him, the golden child made his ultimate move. The man who had demanded a son to carry on his proud, fearless legacy completely crumbled under the pressure of federal authority. Malik threw his hands up in the air and suddenly shouted at the top of his lungs for the detectives to wait. He pointed a shaking, cowardly finger directly at his own weeping mother and screamed that he had absolutely nothing to do with the stolen church money. He yelled that he was completely innocent and that the entire embezzlement scheme to buy the mistress a house was entirely her idea from the very beginning. Malik pointed his trembling finger directly at the woman who had spent her entire life shielding him from the consequences of his own terrible choices. He did not hesitate for a single second before throwing his mother completely under the bus just to save his own skin. He took another step away from Vivian, putting physical distance between himself and the impending federal arrest. He yelled at the detectives that he was a highly respected wealth management executive and he would never jeopardize his prestigious career by stealing from a community church. He claimed that Vivian had come to him months ago crying about her severe financial struggles and begging for his immediate help to secure a private real estate investment. He told the federal agents that she had manipulated him into signing the property deed for the luxury townhouse by leveraging his deep love and obligation to his family. He insisted that he thought the money was coming from her own legitimate retirement savings, and he had absolutely no idea that she was secretly siphoning massive funds from the megachurch charity accounts. He spoke incredibly fast, his voice rising in pitch as he desperately tried to build a convincing narrative where he was just a loving son who had been completely deceived by a corrupt parent. He completely ignored the fact that his mother was standing right next to him, listening to every single treacherous word falling from his mouth. Vivian stood completely frozen, her jaw hanging open as she listened to the golden child she had worshipped and protected her entire life absolutely destroy her to avoid a prison sentence. The color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and hollowed out. She had spent the last 30 years tearing down other women, including me, just to elevate Malik and ensure he always appeared flawless to the outside world. She had mocked my background, insulted my daughters, and actively helped him hide his mistress just to secure a male heir that would carry on his supposedly elite legacy. And now, in her darkest moment of absolute terror, the son she had sacrificed all her morals for was tossing her directly to the federal authorities without a second thought. She looked at Malik with tear-filled eyes, whispering his name and begging him to stop talking, but Malik refused to even look in her direction. He kept his eyes locked on the lead detective, desperately trying to convince the agent that he was nothing more than an innocent victim caught in his mother's wicked web of deceit. Vivian reached out a shaking hand, trying to grab his sleeve to make him face her, but he violently jerked his arm away, stepping closer to the federal agents, as if seeking their protection from the very woman who gave him life. The absolute heartbreak radiating from Vivian was palpable, but I felt absolutely zero sympathy for the woman who had happily tried to throw me and my newborn baby out onto the street. I sat up a little higher against my hospital pillows, shifting my newborn daughter gently in my arms as I watched the ultimate family betrayal unfold right in front of me. I let out a soft, cold laugh that cut through the frantic tension in the room. I told Malik that his performance was truly pathetic, but it was not going to save him from sharing a concrete cell with the woman he was currently trying to sacrifice. I reached over to the bedside table and picked up my cell phone again, unlocking the screen with a calm, deliberate motion. I told the room that when I first suspected Malik was hiding marital assets in preparation for his arrogant divorce filing, I did not just hire a forensic accounting team to look into the corporate ledgers at the investment firm. I explained that I also had a high-level private security firm sweep our entire estate, including the private home office, where Malik and Vivian spent countless hours plotting behind my back. I knew that people who operate with such massive egos always leave a trail of undeniable evidence because they truly believe they are completely untouchable. I tapped the screen of my phone and opened a highly secured audio file that my investigators had extracted from a hidden recording device. I told the federal detectives that the story Malik was currently spinning about being a naive victim was completely fabricated, and I had the digital proof to shut him down permanently. I pressed play and cranked the volume to the maximum level, ensuring every single person in the room could hear the crystal-clear audio recording. The unmistakable voice of my husband echoed off the sterile hospital walls, sending a sudden shockwave of absolute terror through his body. In the recording, Malik was the one aggressively barking orders at his mother, telling her exactly how to funnel the church building funds through the dummy contracting companies he had personally established. He specifically instructed her on how to forge the approval signatures and warned her to make sure the money was transferred into the offshore trust before I could file any legal motions during our impending divorce. Vivian could be heard in the background nervously agreeing to his every demand and promising that she would handle the church finance board so he could secure the luxury townhouse for his mistress and their new son. The recording proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Malik was not manipulated into signing the real estate documents. He was the absolute mastermind behind the entire financial operation, using his own mother's prestigious church position as a shield to hide his stolen assets. He had orchestrated the grand theft to ensure his mistress lived in absolute luxury, while intentionally trying to leave me and our 6 daughters completely destitute on the streets of Atlanta. I had meticulously planned every single step of his financial betrayal, calculating exactly how much money he needed to steal from the congregation to fund his secret second life. I paused the audio recording and looked directly at the man who had just spent the last 5 minutes screaming about his total innocence. The arrogant executive who had thrown divorce papers on my bleeding stomach just an hour ago was now completely silent, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to find a way out of a perfectly executed trap. Vivian let out a loud, agonizing wail as the reality of her son's profound betrayal and their mutual destruction fully set in. She collapsed against the hospital wall, sliding down, until she was sitting on the cold linoleum floor, weeping uncontrollably into her hands. She finally realized that her relentless pursuit of toxic status and her blind devotion to a wicked man had cost her absolutely everything she valued in this world. She had lost her beloved church, her pristine reputation, her generational wealth, and the son she had ruined her own soul to protect. She rocked back and forth on the floor, completely shattered by the absolute finality of her situation, knowing that she would be spending the last years of her life fighting federal prosecutors instead of attending high society brunches. The lead federal detective stepped forward, closing the physical distance between himself and my terrified husband. He looked at Malik with a hard, unwavering expression that offered absolutely no sympathy for the disgraced executive. He pulled a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt, allowing the metallic clicking sound to fill the heavy silence of the hospital room. He told Malik that he really appreciated the unsolicited verbal confession because it made their ongoing investigation significantly easier to process. He explained that trying to pin the blame on an accomplice does not erase the fact that he actively participated in moving stolen nonprofit funds across state lines. The detective smirked slightly and informed Malik that both he and his mother were now officially under federal investigation for wire fraud, money laundering, and severe tax evasion. Malik stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the tile floor as he desperately tried to retreat from the federal agents. He held his hands up in a pathetic defensive gesture, shaking his head and stammering that there had to be some sort of monumental misunderstanding. He looked at Pastor Jenkins, begging the spiritual leader to intervene and show him some grace, but the pastor simply turned his back and refused to acknowledge the desperate pleas of a man who had robbed the community blind. Malik looked at Trent, hoping his brother-in-law would step in to defend him, But Trent was still pinned against the wall by my security guard, sweating and trembling in his own state of absolute panic. The trap had officially snapped shut from every possible angle, and the golden child was finally going to face the brutal, uncompromising consequences of his own arrogance. Sierra watched the federal agents pull out their heavy steel handcuffs, and the carefully constructed mask of the sweet, devoted new mother completely dissolved from her face. She took a massive physical step away from Malik, as if his sudden impending poverty was a highly contagious disease. She clutched the baby tightly against her chest, but her eyes were darting frantically around the hospital room, looking for an immediate exit strategy. She realized in real time that the lavish elite lifestyle she had been promised was evaporating right before her eyes. The man she thought was a powerful, untouchable financial titan was actually just a pathetic coward who had just handed his own weeping mother over to the federal government to save himself. Sierra let out a sharp, bitter laugh that sounded absolutely nothing like the soft, elegant giggles she had been forcing all morning. She looked at the disgraced executive with absolute revulsion, and her entire demeanor shifted into pure survival mode. She raised her voice so loudly that the harsh sound echoed down the sterile hospital corridor, drawing the attention of passing nurses. She demanded to know if Malik was actually completely broke and powerless. She screamed that he had spent the last 2 years feeding her elaborate, detailed lies about his massive generational wealth and his untouchable status in the corporate world. She yelled that he had thoroughly convinced her that I was just a miserable, broke housewife who was draining his accounts and holding him back from his true potential. Sierra paced back and forth, furiously adjusting the expensive powder blue cashmere baby blanket while verbally destroying the man she had just claimed to love. She told Malik that she was a young, beautiful woman in the prime of her life, and she absolutely refused to spend the next 20 years taking public buses to a federal penitentiary just to visit a disgraced inmate. She made it perfectly clear that her loyalty came with a very strict price tag, and his account balances had just hit zero. Malik tried to reach out to her, holding his hands up and begging her to calm down in front of the authorities. He promised her that he would hire the best defense lawyers in the city to fix the situation and get his money back. Sierra slapped his hand away with vicious force, telling him to never touch her again. She said she was not going to let his colossal stupidity and fragile ego drag her down into a miserable life of poverty and intense public humiliation. Sierra then turned her furious attention away from Malik and focused entirely on Vivian, who was still sobbing uncontrollably on the cold linoleum floor. Sierra marched right up to the disgraced church treasurer and demanded the physical property deed to the luxury suburban townhouse. She yelled down at the weeping older woman, ordering her to hand over the legal ownership documents immediately so she could secure her own future. Sierra rapidly calculated that if she could sell the property quickly on the private market, she could take the cash and disappear before the dust settled on the massive corporate fallout. She told Vivian that she had done her specific part of the bargain by delivering the precious male heir the family was so incredibly obsessed with, and now it was time for them to pay up. She demanded the title free and clear, insisting that she was not going to walk away from this total disaster empty-handed after everything she had sacrificed. Vivian could barely lift her head through her heavy tears, let alone formulate a coherent response to the aggressive demands being shouted at her by the furious young woman. I adjusted my position against the hospital pillows, watching the mistress scramble desperately for a piece of a financial pie that no longer existed. I spoke with a steady, quiet authority that instantly silenced the chaotic shouting match happening at the foot of my bed. I told Sierra that she was not going to sell a single square foot of that suburban property. I explained that the beautiful luxury townhouse she had been parading around in for the last 3 months was officially classified as a federal crime scene. I detailed how Vivian had purchased that exact property using the hundreds of thousands of dollars she had directly embezzled from the church charity and community building funds. I watched the intense greed in the eyes of the mistress quickly morph into sheer, suffocating panic as I laid out the brutal reality of her legal situation. I informed Sierra that because the home was bought entirely with illicit stolen money, the federal government had already initiated full asset forfeiture protocols. I told her that federal agents were highly likely pulling up to the manicured driveway of that townhouse at this exact moment to place official seizure notices on the front door. I looked directly at her pale, terrified face and told her she had exactly until midnight to pack up her personal clothes and whatever cheap items she had brought into the home before the government locked the doors permanently and changed the alarm codes. Sierra stumbled backward, the devastating truth finally settling deep into her bones. She realized that the luxury vehicles, the designer baby clothes, and the sprawling suburban home were all a temporary mirage built entirely on stolen church offerings and my hidden tech millions. She had traded her time and her body to a man who was nothing more than a spectacular financial fraud, playing dress-up in suits I had paid for. She looked around the busy hospital room and saw that there was absolutely no one left to fund her lavish lifestyle. Trent was pinned against the wall facing his own severe corporate embezzlement charges. Vivian was being read her rights by the federal detectives while weeping on the floor. Malik was standing there looking completely pathetic and entirely powerless, stripped of his title, his pride, and his bank accounts. Sierra was backed into an inescapable corner of poverty, and the sudden devastating loss of her anticipated millionaire lifestyle turned her completely malicious. She turned her attention back to Malik, and the look in her eyes was pure lethal vindictiveness. She let out another harsh, grating laugh, shaking her head at the pathetic, empty man standing before her. She told Malik that since he had decided to ruin her entire future and leave her with absolutely nothing, she was going to give him a special parting gift to remember her by while he sat in a prison cell. She stepped closer to him, ensuring he could hear every single deliberate syllable she was about to drop. She asked him if he wanted to know the absolute best part of this entire miserable situation. She reminded him of how deeply obsessed he was with his family legacy and how desperately he wanted a male heir to carry on his prestigious name. She told Malik that he had maliciously thrown away his 10-year marriage, his beautiful daughters, and his corporate empire for a son that did not even belong to him. She admitted with a cruel, twisted smirk that she had been sleeping with her personal trainer for months before she got pregnant. She proudly confessed that she had completely faked the paternity test results to trap Malik because she knew his toxic obsession with having a boy would make him a remarkably easy target for financial exploitation. She looked at the broken man who had sacrificed his entire world for a fake legacy and told him that his precious male heir was nothing but a convenient prop she used to secure a luxury house. The devastating revelation from Sierra hung in the heavy, sterile air of the hospital room, leaving Malik completely shattered. The arrogant wealth management executive who had walked in here throwing divorce papers on my bed was now a pathetic, broken shell of a man. His entire identity had been built around the toxic obsession with securing a male heir to carry on his supposedly elite legacy. He had willingly sacrificed his 10-year marriage, his 6 beautiful daughters, and his absolute financial security for a child that did not even carry a single drop of his blood. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train, and his knees buckled beneath him. Malik collapsed onto the cold linoleum floor, weeping uncontrollably and burying his face in his hands. He let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure defeat, mourning the instant evaporation of his wife, his immense wealth, his powerful job, his mother, and his fake son. The federal agents, Pastor Jenkins, and the security guards all watched the spectacular downfall of a man who had chosen greed over loyalty. But while every single person in the room was completely distracted by the dramatic emotional breakdown happening at the foot of my bed, another desperate rat was making his final move. Trent had been standing frozen against the wall ever since my security team had pinned him there earlier. He had been quietly watching the federal agents arrest his mother-in-law, and he had watched the entire financial empire he relied on crumble into dust. He knew that the unredacted corporate audit report, exposing his $2 million embezzlement scheme, was currently sitting in the hands of my legal team. I was terrified of spending the next decade locked away in a federal prison cell, and his primal survival instincts kicked into overdrive. While the guards were momentarily looking down at Malik weeping on the floor, Trent saw a desperate window of opportunity. He slowly and quietly edged his way along the wall, inching closer to the leather overnight bag, resting on the chair next to my hospital bed. He had seen me pull the financial documents and the flash drive from that exact bag. In his panicked mind, he deduced that the master files containing the undeniable proof of his corporate theft must be stored on the silver laptop protruding from the side pocket of the bag. Trent suddenly lunged forward, snatching the laptop with both hands and bolted toward the open hospital door. I thought he had outsmarted the entire room. He truly believed that if he could just get out of the hospital and physically destroy the hardware, he could wipe the server and erase the digital footprint of his massive wire fraud. But Trent did not even make it 2 steps into the hallway before his pathetic escape attempt was brutally shut down. The massive private security guards flanking my bed reacted with absolute lethal speed. They did not shout a warning or ask him to stop. They simply moved. One of the guards lunged forward and tackled Trent directly to the floor with a bone-jarring thud that shook the medical equipment. Trent hit the ground hard. The breath knocked completely out of his lungs, but he still desperately gripped the laptop in his sweating hands. He thrashed violently against the immense weight of the guard pinning him down, trying to smash the silver computer against the hard tile floor. He slammed the device down once, cracking the sleek external casing, but before he could strike it a second time, the other guard stepped on his wrist, neutralizing his frantic attack. Trent was left pinned to the ground, breathless and bruised, but he let out a wild, desperate laugh. He craned his neck to look back into the hospital room, a manic, triumphant gleam in his eyes. He screamed that it was too late, and that he had already wiped the internal company server remotely before the takeover was finalized. He yelled that he had all the master passwords stored securely on that specific laptop, and by destroying the hardware, he was effectively burning the only bridge to his encrypted offshore accounts. He boasted that without the physical master drive, I would never be able to present the Federal Exchange Commission with the concrete digital evidence required to convict him of embezzlement. I thought he had successfully burned the evidence of his $2 million theft right in front of my face, and he was incredibly proud of his own chaotic sabotage. I did not panic. I did not yell for the guards to be careful with the equipment. I simply shifted my newborn daughter into a more comfortable position in my arms and let out a soft, cold laugh that echoed down the quiet corridor. I slowly shifted my weight and swung my legs over the side of the hospital bed, ignoring the sharp pain radiating from my surgical incision. I stood up, planting my bare feet firmly on the cold floor, and wrapped a light hospital robe around my shoulders. I walked with slow, deliberate steps toward the doorway, where Trent was still pinned underneath my security detail. I looked down at the pathetic man who had stolen millions of dollars to fund his wife's fake luxury lifestyle, and I picked up the cracked silver laptop from the floor. I held the damaged computer up so Trent could see it clearly. I asked him if he honestly believed that the chief executive officer of a $100 million financial technology company would be stupid enough to bring the actual unencrypted master drive containing highly sensitive federal audit reports into a public hospital room. I watched his manic smile falter slightly as the reality of his situation began to sink in. I calmly explained that the device he had just risked a federal assault charge to destroy was nothing more than a cheap decoy computer. It was a digital honeypot specifically designed and programmed by my elite cybersecurity team to trap corporate rats exactly like him. I told Trent that the laptop did not contain a single shred of actual financial data. Instead, it contained a highly aggressive tracking software protocol. I explained that the very moment he had tried to remotely log into the Vanguard Capital's servers earlier that morning to wipe his tracks, the honeypot laptop had instantly pinged his exact location. It did not just block his access, it automatically mirrored his entire hidden hard drive and forwarded the complete unencrypted contents directly to the Security and Exchange Commission. I looked dead into his terrified eyes and informed him that he had not destroyed any evidence today. He had actually initiated the automated protocol that handed his entire offshore routing history, his fake vendor invoices, and his complete confession straight to the federal government. I told him that his desperate attempt to cover up his crimes was the exact action that officially sealed his federal indictment. The profound silence that followed my revelation was incredibly satisfying. Trent stopped struggling against the security guards completely. The color drained from his face and his head dropped against the floor in absolute crushing defeat. He realized that every single move he made had been anticipated and countered by a woman he had spent the last 10 years treating like an uneducated peasant. I had played a high-stakes game of corporate espionage against a tech mogul, and he had lost everything. While Trent lay on the floor processing his impending prison sentence, the atmosphere in the room shifted once again. Jasmine had been standing near the back wall watching the entire scene unfold in a state of absolute horror. She had watched her mother get arrested for stealing from a church. She had watched her brother lose his massive wealth and his fake son. And now she was watching her high-earning husband get tackled to the ground and exposed as a federal criminal. She realized with terrifying clarity that the millions of dollars funding her elite country club memberships, her luxury vacations, and her extensive collection of designer bags were completely gone. She was about to be entirely penniless and deeply implicated in a massive federal tax fraud investigation because she had gleefully signed joint tax returns, hiding the stolen money. The weight of her total financial ruin and impending legal disaster crashed down on her all at once. The arrogant, entitled sister-in-law who had marched into my hospital room intending to mock my poverty suddenly dropped to her knees right in the middle of the floor. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the presence of the federal agents and the security team. She stopped right in front of me, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect, expensive makeup. She looked up at me with desperate, pleading eyes, completely abandoning all her previous pride and superiority. She clasped her hands together and began begging for mercy, pleading with me to save her from the absolute destruction her family had brought upon themselves. Jasmine remained on the cold hospital floor, staring up at me with tears cutting deep, dark tracks through her expensive foundation. She brought her perfectly manicured hands together in a frantic pleading gesture, completely discarding the arrogant superiority she had worn into the room just an hour ago. She begged me to believe that she had absolutely no idea her husband was stealing millions of dollars from the investment firm. She insisted that Trent handled all of their complex financial portfolios, and she was just an innocent, trusting wife who relied entirely on the man she married to provide for their family. She pointed a shaking finger at Trent, who was still pinned firmly under the weight of my security team, and loudly declared that she would gladly testify against him in any federal court. She offered to turn over every single piece of digital evidence, personal financial record, and hidden safe combination she could find in their sprawling suburban home if I would just spare her from the impending financial slaughter. She reached out, trying to touch the edge of my white hospital blanket, and played the ultimate emotional manipulation card. She cried that we were family, and that we were sisters who desperately needed to stick together in times of devastating crisis. She begged me not to let the authorities take her luxury home, her imported cars, and her hidden assets, claiming she would simply not survive being stripped of her high society standing and forced into humiliating poverty. I looked down at the weeping woman and pulled my blanket slightly out of her reach, refusing to let her toxic hands contaminate my personal space. I told Jasmine that she permanently lost the right to use the word sister the very moment she decided to participate in the systematic emotional and verbal abuse of my innocent children. I reminded her of the countless Sunday dinners where she sat at my dining table eating the elaborate meals I spent hours preparing while making relentless passive-aggressive comments about the natural hair of my daughters. I detailed exactly how she used to smirk and tell everyone in the family that my little girls needed harsh chemical relaxers just to look presentable and acceptable in polite society. She had proudly flaunted her own expensive imported weaves paid for by her high-earning white savior husband while intentionally making my daughters feel deeply insecure about their own beautiful features. I made sure she heard every single word as I methodically dismantled her fake sisterhood, recalling how she constantly mocked my South Side background and acted like her proximity to a white financial director made her absolute royalty among our peers. I pointed out that she had happily spent millions of dollars of stolen corporate funds without ever once stopping to question how a mid-level executive could afford to buy her a brand new imported sports car every single year and fund lavish month-long vacations across Europe. I told her that ignorance was absolutely not a valid legal defense when she was actively wearing massive diamond earrings bought with embezzled money while simultaneously plotting with her mother to leave me penniless on the street. I shifted my newborn daughter carefully to my other shoulder, ensuring she remained fast asleep despite the chaotic tension filling the recovery room. I reached my free hand into the thick blue legal portfolio resting on my plastic tray table. I pulled out a heavy stapled legal document marked prominently with official government seals and dropped it directly onto the floor right in front of her trembling knees. I told Jasmine that the paper she was staring at with wide, terrified eyes was a fully drafted formal confession to the Internal Revenue Service regarding the massive joint tax fraud she had actively committed alongside Trent. I explained the brutal reality of federal financial law to the sobbing woman kneeling before me. I detailed that when you file joint marital tax returns claiming millions of dollars of illicit untaxed income hidden through dummy corporations and offshore accounts, both spouses are held equally and entirely liable under the law. I told her that she could not claim innocent spouse relief because my forensic accounting team had already uncovered the digital paper trail proving she actively transferred the stolen funds into her personal shopping accounts. I watched her entire body shake in absolute terror as she realized that she was not just a naive bystander, but a legally documented accomplice to a massive federal crime that carried severe mandatory minimum sentencing. I gave her a very simple and uncompromising ultimatum that would determine the entire trajectory of her remaining life. I told her she could pick up the metal pen resting on my bedside table and sign her name on the dotted line, providing a full sworn confession of the tax evasion and an unconditional surrender of all her physical and financial assets to the federal government. If she agreed to willingly hand over the luxury cars, the designer bag collections, the offshore accounts, and the massive suburban home I promised, I would not press secondary corporate charges against her personally. But I made it crystal clear that if she hesitated for even one single second or refused to sign the document, I would hand her fraudulent joint tax returns straight to the federal prosecutors waiting in the hallway and ensure she shared a tiny concrete federal prison cell right alongside the husband she was so eager to betray. Jasmine did not even need to think about the brutal choice I had just presented to her. The absolute terror of facing a merciless federal judge and spending the best decades of her life locked behind iron bars completely overrode any lingering sense of marital loyalty she had toward the man pinned to the floor. She scrambled forward clumsily on her hands and knees, grabbing the heavy metal pen from the bedside table with frantic shaking fingers. Trent lifted his bruised face from the hard linoleum floor and screamed at his wife, begging her not to sign the written confession. He yelled that they could hire the best defense attorneys in the city and fight the corporate charges together if she just held on to her constitutional rights and refused to cooperate with my demands. Jasmine completely ignored the desperate, agonizing cries of her husband, acting as if the man she had loved and paraded around town for years simply did not exist. She did not even cast a single glance in his direction as she flipped frantically to the final page of the thick legal document and aggressively signed her name across the signature line, pressing so hard that the tip of the pen nearly tore straight through the thick paper. She signed away her entire luxurious lifestyle, her massive home, and her marriage in a matter of desperate seconds, just to save her own skin from the crushing weight of the federal justice system. She handed the signed confession back to me, her chest heaving with panicked, ragged sobs as she waited for my final judgment. I took the document, verifying that her signature was properly executed and legally binding before tucking it safely back into my dark blue portfolio. I looked down at the broken, penniless, and utterly defeated woman still kneeling submissively on the floor of my hospital recovery room. I offered her a tight, cold, and completely emotionless smile and told her she had made a very smart and highly necessary decision. Then I raised my hand and pointed directly toward the open hospital doorway, instructing her to get out of my room immediately because I had a corporate board meeting to attend. 2 hours later, the automatic glass doors of the towering Vanguard Capital skyscraper slid open. I stepped into the sprawling marble lobby, looking absolutely flawless, in a custom-tailored emerald green power suit. My medical team had finalized an expedited hospital discharge, and my elite private security detail flanked my every single move. Right behind me walked my highly trusted nanny, carefully holding my sleeping newborn daughter, wrapped in a soft cashmere blanket. The physical pain from my recent surgery was completely masked by the pure adrenaline of securing my ultimate financial victory. The reception staff completely froze at their sleek, minimalist desks, staring in absolute shock as the massive security team marched me directly toward the private executive elevators. I swiped my newly activated Absolute Access keycard and pressed the glowing button for the top floor, preparing to completely decimate the corporate stronghold. My disgraced husband thought he still controlled. While I was riding the high-speed elevator up to the penthouse suite, Malik was desperately trying to stage his final pathetic rebellion. His high-priced defense attorneys had managed to secure a brief emergency delay on his physical federal booking, giving him a temporary 3-hour window to surrender himself to the authorities. Instead of using that precious time to call his remaining daughters or find a viable criminal defense strategy, the arrogant executive had rushed straight to his office building. He had frantically summoned the entire board of directors for an emergency closed-door meeting. Malik was actively trying to rally the old boys club of elite executives, hoping to use their combined corporate voting power to block my physical entry into the executive suite and retain his prestigious title as chief executive officer. The heavy mahogany doors of the primary boardroom stood at the very end of the long glass hallway. I did not bother knocking or waiting for an administrative assistant to announce my arrival. I gave a subtle nod to my lead security guard, who immediately pushed the double doors wide open with a loud, echoing thud that instantly silenced the chaotic shouting inside the room. I walked into the massive corporate space with my head held high, projecting an aura of absolute lethal confidence. The expansive room was filled with 15 wealthy older men, wearing expensive suits, all sitting around a massive custom-built conference table. Malik was standing at the head of the table, sweating profusely and pointing frantically at a digital presentation displayed on the projector screen. He stopped mid-sentence the moment his eyes locked onto me, and the remaining color instantly drained from his face. The room erupted into angry murmurs and immediate outrage as I calmly took a seat directly opposite of my terrified husband. My security team positioned themselves strategically around the perimeter of the room, ensuring that not a single person could approach me or my newborn daughter, who was resting peacefully in the arms of my nanny near the doorway. The men sitting around the table looked at me with deep expressions of utter disdain and pure, unadulterated sexism. They were a unified front of arrogant, traditional corporate titans who absolutely hated the idea of a young black woman invading their exclusive financial sanctuary. They whispered among themselves, exchanging condescending glances and shaking their heads at my sheer audacity for showing up at their emergency strategy meeting. They clearly believed that the federal investigation surrounding Malik was just a minor misunderstanding that their expensive legal teams could easily sweep under the rug. The lead board member was an incredibly wealthy and notoriously arrogant older man named Richard, who had personally mentored Malik for the past decade. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the polished mahogany table, and looked at me with a completely patronizing smirk. He cleared his throat loudly, demanding the attention of the entire room before he addressed me directly. He spoke with a slow, insulting drawl, telling me that I needed to pack up my security team and my baby and leave the premises immediately. He acknowledged that I might have somehow magically acquired the majority shares of the parent company through a hostile blind buyout. But he insisted that corporate governance did not work the way I thought it did. Richard continued his condescending lecture, explaining that Vanguard Capital was protected by a very specific set of complex internal corporate bylaws. He proudly declared that the men sitting at the table controlled the vast majority of the executive voting blocks, and they had absolutely no intention of letting a random, inexperienced housewife take over their prestigious operations. He told me that they had just concluded a unanimous emergency vote to completely block my access to the executive suite and nullify my administrative authority. He puffed out his chest and announced that Malik was going to remain the active chief executive officer of the firm, and they were preparing to file a massive corporate injunction to freeze my hostile acquisition by the end of the business day. He smiled a nasty, triumphant smile, genuinely believing that his powerful old boys club had successfully outmaneuvered my entire financial strategy and secured their illicit empire. I sat quietly in the luxurious leather chair, simply watching Richard finish his pathetic little speech. I did not interrupt him or raise my voice to defend my professional qualifications. I waited until the room was completely silent, and the men were all smirking at each other in mutual arrogant agreement. Then I slowly reached into the sleek leather briefcase resting near my feet. I pulled out a massive, thick black binder filled to the brim with hundreds of highly sensitive financial documents and certified bank records. I lifted the heavy binder and tossed it directly onto the center of the polished mahogany table, allowing it to land with a loud, resounding crash that made several of the executives physically jump in their seats. I leaned forward, resting my own elbows on the table, mirroring the exact posture Richard had used just moments ago. I looked directly into his condescending eyes and completely wiped the smug smile right off his wrinkled face. I told the arrogant board member that he and his elite friends did not control a single thing in this building anymore. I explained that when my forensic accounting team was scrubbing the corporate servers, they did not just stop at the company ledgers or the standard payroll accounts. I looked around the room, making dead eye contact with every single wealthy executive sitting at the massive table. I told them that I did not just buy the investment firm today. I explained that I had used my vast capital reserves to quietly purchase their underwater mortgages, their secret offshore gambling debts, and the illicit private loans they had been desperately hiding from their wives and the federal government. I announced with absolute lethal clarity that I had systematically bought the personal toxic debts of every single man sitting in this room. I stared at Richard as the heavy black binder rested on the center of the mahogany table. I did not raise my voice, but the quiet, absolute authority in my tone made every powerful man in the room hold their breath. I looked directly at the arrogant board member and instructed him to open the binder. He hesitated, his wrinkled hands trembling slightly, so I reached over and flipped the thick cover open myself. I began reading the top financial document aloud, detailing the massive offshore gambling debts Richard had racked up in Macau over the past 5 years. I explained that when the foreign casinos threatened to physically retaliate against him for non-payment, he had taken out massive illegal loans through a shadow syndicate just to keep his elite social standing intact. I watched his face contort with absolute horror as I told him that I had used my holding companies to buy out that exact syndicate last month. I informed him that I was now the sole legal owner of his $3 million gambling debt, and his entire personal safety was resting entirely in my hands. The smug, condescending smile he had worn just moments ago completely vanished, leaving behind the terrified expression of a man who realized his life was over. I turned my attention to the man sitting to his left, an arrogant senior partner named William, who had spent his entire career underpaying and sneering at minority employees. I recited the exact routing numbers of the hidden offshore bank accounts he used to evade federal taxes and hide liquid assets from his third wife during their bitter divorce. I explained that I had legally acquired the outstanding markers on his luxury yachts and the heavily underwater mortgage on his summer estate in the Hamptons. One by one, I systematically went down the line of the massive conference table, exposing every single wealthy executive in the room. I read aloud their hidden personal bankruptcies, their illicit private loans, and the desperate financial shell games they had been playing for a decade, just to maintain their fake illusion of supreme corporate dominance. I told them that they had built a toxic corporate culture of intense arrogance and severe misogyny while secretly drowning in massive toxic debt. I made it crystal clear that I had just bought every single drop of that toxic debt for pennies on the dollar, and they were all entirely financially enslaved to me. I leaned back in my luxurious leather chair and announced that their prestigious old boys club was officially and permanently dissolved. I told the 15 powerful executives sitting around the table that they were all terminated effective immediately without severance and without any golden parachutes. I stated that they had exactly 5 minutes to gather their personal desk belongings and surrender their corporate access cards before my private security detail physically escorted them out of the skyscraper and tossed them onto the street. Richard tried to sputter a pathetic defense, claiming that they would rally their personal legal teams and sue me for wrongful termination, but his voice shook with absolute terror. I calmly reminded him that if any of them dared to file a single legal motion or contest my hostile acquisition, I would hand the completely unredacted contents of the black binder directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I watched as 15 grown men who had spent their entire lives treating women like disposable objects stood up in complete silent defeat. They looked like beaten animals as they shuffled slowly toward the boardroom doors, totally stripped of their wealth, their dignity, and their unearned corporate power. As the disgraced executives filed out into the glass hallway, I gave a subtle nod to my lead security guard. He spoke quietly into his communication earpiece, and less than a minute later, the heavy mahogany boardroom doors opened once again. A group of 7 highly qualified, brilliant black and brown women walked hesitantly into the expansive room. They were the senior analysts, the risk managers, and the financial strategists who had been deliberately kept in cramped windowless cubicles for years. They were the ones doing all the actual grueling analytical work, generating the massive portfolio profits that the male executives had shamelessly taken all the credit for. I invited the women to step forward and take the plush leather seats that the corrupt board members had just vacated. I looked at these overworked and deeply underpaid women who had been constantly passed over for promotions simply because they did not fit the traditional elite corporate mold. I addressed them with genuine respect and profound admiration, thanking them for holding the investment firm together, while the male executives foolishly squandered its resources on mistresses and gambling debts. I announced right then and there that I was promoting every single one of them to the position of executive vice president. I informed them that their salaries were being tripled immediately, and they would now comprise the new active board of directors for the entire financial institution. I watched tears of shock and overwhelming joy fill their eyes as they realized their years of silent dedication were finally being recognized and rewarded with immense corporate power. Malik had been standing completely frozen near the projector screen, watching his entire universe get methodically dismantled and rebuilt without him. He watched the brilliant minority women take their rightful places at the massive mahogany table, assuming the immense corporate power he thought he was genetically born to hold. The arrogant, commanding wealth management executive who had demanded a male heir was completely gone. His custom-tailored designer suit suddenly looked baggy and pathetic on his trembling, shrinking frame. He realized with terrifying clarity that the federal agents were still waiting for him outside the corporate building, and he had absolutely no money left to hire a criminal defense attorney to keep himself out of a federal prison cell. He took a slow, desperate step toward me, his massive ego and pride completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The man who had verbally abused me and my daughters suddenly dropped his head in pure total submission. He begged me for a job, pleading with a weak, cracking voice that echoed pitifully in the large room. He said he would take absolutely any position I could offer him. He cried that he desperately needed a paycheck to cover his mounting legal fees and keep himself from rotting away in a maximum security penitentiary. He clasped his hands together in front of his chest, looking like a miserable beggar pleading for a scrap of mercy from the very woman he had treated like garbage for 10 years. I sat perfectly still, holding my sleeping newborn daughter securely against my chest, and looked him up and down with an expression of absolute freezing contempt. I let the heavy silence stretch out across the room, forcing him to wallow in his complete and utter humiliation in front of the newly appointed female executive board. I tilted my head slightly and told him that after reviewing the corporate payroll budgets, I did actually have one single opening available for a man with his specific lack of financial qualifications. I informed him that the night shift janitor had abruptly quit that very morning, and we were in desperate need of someone to handle the heavy sanitation duties around the building. I offered my disgraced husband a cold, merciless smile and told him he could start his brand new career by grabbing a bucket of bleach and scrubbing the floors of my executive office. Malik stared at me with pure venom pooling in his dark eyes as the reality of my offer hung in the heavy air of the executive suite. The sheer disrespect of being offered a sanitation job inside the very building he used to rule completely shattered whatever tiny fragment of composure he had left. He spat at the plush carpet near my feet, his face twisting into an ugly mask of wounded male pride. He took a heavy step toward the mahogany table, his voice dripping with absolute arrogance as he told me I was completely delusional if I thought he would ever scrub a floor for me or anyone else. He boasted that he was a highly respected financial titan in the city of Atlanta. He claimed he had spent the last decade building a vast network of elite corporate connections and playing golf with the most powerful men in the entire state. He sneered at the newly appointed board of female executives, telling them they were nothing but glorified secretaries playing dress-up in a real man's world. He boldly declared that he did not need Vanguard Capital or my stolen technology money to maintain his lavish lifestyle and his supreme social standing. He promised that he would simply walk out of this building, make a single phone call, and have a highly lucrative executive position at a rival firm before the sun even went down. I was absolutely convinced that his elite old boys club would welcome him with open arms and help him launch a massive legal counterattack to destroy my entire tech empire and put me back in my place. I did not even blink at his pathetic attempt to salvage his shattered ego. I just kept my eyes locked on his flushed, angry face as a soft electronic chime echoed through the expansive boardroom. Instantly, the four massive flat-screen televisions mounted along the glass walls of the room flickered to life. The screens automatically switched away from the corporate stock tickers and instantly tuned into the largest local news network in Atlanta. The bright red banner for breaking news flashed across the bottom of the screens, accompanied by the serious, authoritative tone of the lead news anchor. Malik stopped his arrogant rant mid-sentence, his eyes darting toward the glowing displays as his own face suddenly filled the television screens. The news anchor spoke with practiced gravity, announcing an unprecedented financial scandal that had just rocked the city's elite society to its very core. The headline rolling beneath the photograph of my disgraced husband read Atlanta wealth manager and megachurch treasurer indicted in multi-million-dollar fraud and paternity scandal. The anchor detailed how a massive anonymous data leak had just exposed a highly coordinated embezzlement ring operating out of a prominent local investment firm. The broadcast showed a split screen featuring Malik on one side and a photograph of his mother Vivian looking proudly in her expensive church robes on the other. The news report explicitly outlined how the mother and son duo had systematically siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars from a beloved megachurch charity fund meant for widows and orphans. The anchor even mentioned the scandalous details of the luxury townhouse bought for a secret mistress and the shocking revelation that the supposed male heir was actually the product of a fake paternity test. The entire sordid, deeply humiliating truth was being broadcast to millions of viewers across the state in real time, complete with B-roll footage of federal agents outside the church. Malik stumbled backward, bumping hard into the heavy leather chair he used to sit in. He watched his entire reputation burn to the ground on live television, his mouth opening and closing as the anchor continued to list his severe federal crimes. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the mahogany table, and offered him a slow, merciless smile. I told him that I had leaked the entire unredacted dossier to the press exactly 30 minutes ago while he was busy trying to rally his corrupt board members in this very room. I explained that I did not just send the documents to the local news stations in Atlanta. I had my highly efficient media team distribute the undeniable digital proof to every major national financial syndicate, every elite business publication, and every prominent social media outlet in the country. I wanted to make absolutely certain that his face and his federal crimes were permanently etched into the public consciousness, making it impossible for him to ever hide from his actions. I looked at the broken man standing before me and told him that his precious reputation was not just dead in this city. It was completely and permanently dead on a global scale. I reminded him of his arrogant threat to simply walk out and get a job at a rival firm using his elite connections. I told him that the financial world operates on absolute trust and strict discretion, and he had just been exposed as the most toxic liability in the entire industry. I made it crystal clear that no prestigious firm in the world would ever let a nationally disgraced federal criminal clean their toilets, let alone touch their wealthy clients' money ever again. He was officially a corporate pariah, totally radioactive to anyone who even dared to speak his name. The devastating reality of his inescapable public ruin finally crushed the last remaining pillar of his fragile ego. Malik clutched his chest, gasping for air, as he realized he could never show his face in a country club, a fine dining restaurant, or a corporate boardroom for the rest of his natural life. Before he could even formulate a single word in response, the heavy mahogany doors of the executive boardroom violently burst open. The sudden loud crash made the newly appointed female executives jump in their seats, turning their attention toward the hallway. Stumbling through the doorway was Vivian, but she looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, flawless socialite who had mocked my background in the hospital room just a few short hours ago. She looked completely disheveled and thoroughly destroyed by the swift hand of justice. Her expensive designer jacket was torn at the shoulder, and her perfectly styled hair was a wild, tangled mess falling into her eyes. The heavy gold jewelry and the designer accessories she always wore to flaunt her stolen wealth had been completely stripped away, leaving her looking incredibly small and fragile. Her face was streaked with running mascara, and she was weeping so hysterically that she could barely catch her breath to speak. She had somehow managed to temporarily break away from the federal agents downstairs and run up to the executive suite in a state of absolute blind panic. Vivian threw herself onto the plush carpet of the boardroom, crawling desperately toward my chair on her hands and knees, ignoring the shocked stares of my security team. She looked up at me with wild, pleading eyes, completely abandoning all her previous pride and elite superiority. She begged me to call the news stations and retract the story, pleading through her heavy sobs that the rapid public humiliation was permanently destroying their entire generational legacy. Vivian remained on her hands and knees, sobbing hysterically into the plush carpet of the executive boardroom. She grabbed the hem of my emerald green suit, begging me to pick up my phone and call the news stations to stop the broadcast. She pleaded through her heavy, gasping breaths that the rapid global humiliation was permanently destroying their entire generational legacy. She cried that her pristine reputation in the community was the only thing she had left, and I was ruthlessly burning it to the ground. She looked up at me with mascara running down her cheeks, looking absolutely nothing like the arrogant, untouchable socialite who had mocked my background in the hospital room just a few hours ago. Her designer jacket was torn, and her perfectly styled hair was a wild, tangled mess falling into her terrified eyes. She had managed to temporarily break away from the federal agents downstairs in a state of absolute blind panic, but she had simply run right into a much more devastating trap. I looked down at the woman who had made my life a living hell for the past 10 years. I did not reach out to help her up from the floor. I did not offer her a tissue or a single word of comfort. I kept my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of pity, ensuring every single woman sitting at the massive mahogany table could hear exactly what kind of monster had been judging them from afar. I told Vivian that she was completely obsessed with a word she did not even understand. I told her that she did not have a legacy to protect. I explained that a real legacy is built on unshakable integrity and honest hard work, not on purchasing limited edition designer bags using stolen church offerings meant for widows and orphans. I told her that a true legacy meant raising strong, intelligent daughters to be fiercely independent and proud of their natural beauty. It did not mean treating women like absolute failures and disposable incubators, simply because they could not provide a male child to carry on a meaningless last name. I reminded Vivian of all the times she boasted about her supreme social standing and her untouchable black excellence. I recalled the extravagant charity galas, the elite Sunday brunches, and the massive financial donations she made in her own name just to ensure her photograph appeared in the local society magazines. I watched her frantic tears begin to slow down as deep confusion started to mix with her blind panic. I decided it was time to completely shatter the very foundation of her arrogant existence and strip away the last remaining illusion she clung to for survival. I leaned forward in my luxurious leather chair and told Vivian that her entire socialite status for the last 5 years was a complete and utter fabrication. I revealed that the massive generational wealth she constantly threw in my face simply did not exist. I explained that when her precious son drove his investment firm into the ground half a decade ago, his massive executive salary was quietly slashed to almost nothing by the previous corporate board. I watched the blood completely drain from her face as I laid out the brutal financial truth. I told her that she had not been living off the brilliant financial acumen of her golden child. She had been living entirely off the massive quarterly dividends generated by my silent technology investments. I detailed exactly how I had routed my personal millions through dummy corporate accounts directly into the payroll system of Vanguard Capital, just so Malik could maintain his inflated salary and continue funding her lavish lifestyle. I told Vivian that every single expensive hat she wore to church, every luxury vehicle she leased, and every elite country club membership fee she paid for the last half-decade was funded entirely by the woman she continuously referred to as a broke ghetto liability. I explained that I had silently bankrolled her entire arrogant existence just to keep the peace in my marriage and protect my daughters from her constant complaining. I watched her eyes widen in absolute unadulterated horror as she realized she had spent years biting the very hand that was secretly feeding her. She had built her entire superior identity on money that was generated by the freelance tax girl she despised. Vivian could not handle the crushing psychological weight of her total exposure, realizing that her entire identity was nothing more than a charity case funded by her deeply hated daughter-in-law. She resorted to the only manipulative tactic she had left in her pathetic arsenal. She let out a loud, dramatic gasp and threw one hand up to her forehead. She allowed her eyes to roll back into her head and forcefully collapsed her entire body onto the boardroom floor, faking a sudden and severe fainting spell. She sprawled out across the expensive carpet, lying completely motionless, hoping that someone in the room would rush to her side and offer her the sympathy and protection she so desperately craved. She expected the entire boardroom to stop their corporate proceedings and coddle her fragile emotional state, just like her son had always done in the past. She truly believed that playing the victim would force me to back down and call for medical assistance, thereby delaying her inevitable return to federal custody. But nobody in the expansive boardroom moved to help her. I remained perfectly still in my chair, gently rocking my sleeping newborn daughter, who was resting peacefully in my arms. I looked over at the 7 newly promoted female executives sitting around the massive mahogany table. These were highly educated, brilliant minority women who had spent years being overlooked, underpaid, and financially abused by the corrupt male leadership that Vivian had actively enabled and protected. They had listened to Malik belittle their work, and they knew exactly how toxic his family truly was. They looked down at the disgraced megachurch treasurer lying on the floor, putting on a pathetic theatrical performance, and they felt absolutely zero compassion for her manufactured suffering. The lead executive, a brilliant woman who had just been named the new chief financial officer, simply gathered her briefing folders from the table. She stood up from her leather chair, smoothing out her professional skirt, and walked directly toward the exit. She did not even pause or look down, as she physically stepped right over the sobbing, shivering body of my mother-in-law. One by one, the other 6 female executives followed her lead. They calmly gathered their personal belongings and their new corporate access cards, stepping over Vivian without a single word of comfort or concern. They walked out of this boardroom with their heads held high, ready to take absolute control of the financial institution that had oppressed them for so long. Vivian peeked through her eyelashes, realizing her fake medical emergency was being completely ignored by every single person in the room. She let out a pathetic whimper, realizing that her manipulative tears held absolutely no power in this new corporate reality. Malik was still frozen near the television screens, too devastated by his own global public ruin to even attempt to help his mother off the ground. He just stared blankly at the breaking news broadcast still playing on the monitors, unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of his total destruction. The heavy silence in the boardroom was suddenly broken by a new and terrifying sound echoing from the long glass hallway outside the suite. It was the loud, rhythmic thud of heavy tactical boots marching in perfect unison across the polished marble floors. The sound grew louder and more imposing with every passing second, signaling the absolute end of their brief escape. The federal agents who had been securing the lobby downstairs had finally made their way up to the penthouse level to retrieve their fugitive. Vivian scrambled to sit up, her fake fainting spell instantly forgotten as true primal fear took over her entire body. Malik slowly turned his head toward the open mahogany doors, his eyes wide with the realization that his temporary delay was officially over. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had officially arrived at the corporate suite to finish the job, and there was absolutely nowhere left for either of them to run. The heavy wrought iron gates of my new private estate slowly swung open, revealing a sprawling manicured landscape bathed in the warm Atlanta sun. It had been exactly 3 weeks since the federal agents escorted my disgraced husband and his corrupt mother out of the corporate skyscraper in handcuffs. I sat in the back of my chauffeured luxury vehicle, looking down at my beautiful newborn daughter, who was resting peacefully in her premium car seat. The air inside the vehicle felt incredibly light and completely free of the suffocating toxic tension that had dominated my life for the past 10 years. As the vehicle pulled up the long, sweeping driveway approaching the massive white columns of my new permanent sanctuary, I looked out the tinted window and saw the absolute best part of my entire immense wealth. My 5 older daughters were running across the lush green lawn, their laughter echoing through the quiet, secure grounds. They looked so incredibly happy and entirely unburdened by the dark, oppressive expectations their father had constantly forced upon them. The driver parked the car, and my security detail opened my door, allowing the girls to instantly swarm around me. They carefully peeked into the vehicle to look at their new baby sister, their faces glowing with pure, unadulterated joy. There were no harsh voices telling them to be quiet or to act like proper silent background decorations. There was only love and absolute freedom in the home I had purchased strictly for our peace. I left the girls playing joyfully on the front lawn under the watchful eye of my trusted nanny and my security staff while I walked into my expansive new home office. The room was flooded with natural light featuring massive windows that overlooked a pristine private lake. Sitting around my custom marble conference table was a team of the most ruthless and brilliant female attorneys and financial planners in the entire country. We were not there to discuss corporate takeovers or hostile acquisitions anymore. We were gathered in my beautiful new sanctuary to execute the most important legal documents I would ever sign in my entire life. I took my seat at the head of the table and instructed my lead attorney to finalize the paperwork for 6 distinct, unbreakable, and ironclad trust funds. I made absolutely certain that the financial structures we were establishing today were completely bulletproof against any outside influence or future marital manipulation. I detailed exactly how the trust would operate, explaining to my legal team that my daughters would never just be handed a blank check to spend recklessly on designer clothes or luxury cars. I demanded that their immense generational wealth be tied directly to mandatory financial literacy programs, advanced educational milestones, and strict asset protection clauses. I wanted to guarantee that my 6 girls would grow up understanding exactly how to manage an empire, multiply their resources, and ruthlessly protect their capital from any predatory individuals. I made sure the legal language explicitly prevented any future husband, partner, or outside investor from ever touching a single penny of their principal assets. I was actively building a fortress of absolute financial independence around my children, ensuring they would never find themselves trapped in a room depending on a toxic man to put a roof over their heads. I wanted them to know how to read market trends, analyze corporate ledgers, and execute their own brilliant business strategies, so they could rule the corporate world without ever needing a man to validate their authority. My lead attorney slid the final stack of documents across the marble table for my signature. As I picked up my pen, she casually mentioned a recent update regarding the ongoing federal investigations downtown. She informed me that Malik had just been officially denied bail by a federal judge who deemed him a severe flight risk after discovering his hidden offshore gambling connections. The man who had demanded a male heir to carry on his elite legacy was currently sitting in a tiny concrete holding cell, facing a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate wire fraud. She added that Vivian was struggling miserably in a county detention facility, completely stripped of her designer clothes and her elite megachurch status, while facing her own extensive list of felony embezzlement charges. Trent and Jasmine were apparently turning on each other in federal court, fighting a bitter and entirely broke legal battle over who was more responsible for the joint tax evasion. I did not smile or gloat at the updates regarding their miserable downfalls. I simply signed my name on the dotted line of the trust documents, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound sense of closure and relief. Their chaotic destruction was no longer my concern or my burden to carry. They were completely erased from my reality, and their impending prison sentences were just the natural, inevitable consequences of their own malicious greed and arrogant entitlement. I had completely detached myself from their toxic existence and refused to spend another second of my new beautiful life thinking about the miserable people who had tried to bury me. I thanked my legal team for their exceptional work and walked out to the expansive back patio of my estate. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and leaned against the smooth stone railing, watching my beautiful daughters play together in the afternoon sun. They were running freely across the grass, building their own games and supporting each other with genuine sisterly love. I looked at the incredible life I had secured for them and reflected on the turbulent journey that had finally brought us to this perfect, peaceful sanctuary. They told me I was worthless because I could not give them a son. They looked at my 6 beautiful girls and saw nothing but a failed genetic lineage and a massive disappointment to their toxic, arrogant pride. But a woman's worth is not defined by the gender of her children. It is defined by the empire she builds and the peace she ruthlessly protects. I had transformed their suffocating hatred into the very fuel I needed to construct a financial fortress that would protect my daughters for generations to come. I had shown my girls that they do not need a man to validate their existence or secure their future. They only need their own brilliant minds, their unshakable integrity, and the courage to walk away from anyone who tries to diminish their light. I was no longer a victim trapped in a toxic marriage trying to earn the approval of a corrupt family. I was a completely independent corporate titan, raising 6 future queens who would eventually inherit the world I had conquered. The best revenge is not screaming or fighting in a hospital room or trading petty insults with people who are committed to misunderstanding you. The best revenge is letting the trash take itself out while you quietly buy the entire landfill. I watched my former husband and his wicked family dig their own graves with their overwhelming greed, and I simply handed them the shovels before purchasing the ground beneath their feet. Has anyone ever tried to bury you, only to realize you were a seed waiting to bloom? Share your story in the comments below. Let me know how you turned their toxic underestimation into your ultimate superpower. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of absolute resilience and ultimate triumph. And remember to protect your peace and always read the fine print. True worth is never defined by external validation or the toxic expectations of others. The protagonist's journey illustrates that while people may attempt to diminish your value based on their narrow prejudices, your resilience and autonomy are your greatest assets. By quietly cultivating her own strength and resources, she turned potential victimhood into absolute power. The story teaches that patient strategic preparation and unwavering self-belief are more potent than immediate retaliation. When you focus on building your own legacy rather than seeking approval from those who wish to see you fail, you become unstoppable. True empowerment comes from within. What is one bold step you are taking today to build your own future? Share your story in the comments.